partners and colleagues. Welcome to this knowledge sharing session that's organized by the International Organization for Migration in light of its project Sri Lanka Understanding Migration, Environmental Degradation and Climate Change, which is funded by IOM's Development Fund. I would like to particularly extend a warm welcome to Ms. Kumuduni Vijayalankara, Director of the Climate Change Secretariat at the Ministry of Environment, as well as to Major General Sudanta Ranasinghe, Director General of the Disaster Management Center. And we are also very pleased to see the participation of the Sustainable Development Council and many other participants from other ministries, such as the Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Agriculture, Power and Energy, Wildlife Protection, Fisheries, and all other members of the Project Steering Committee. It's really great to see this session with so many professionals from different backgrounds and different expertises, which is exactly what exploring the nexus between migration, environment, and climate change should be about. So in today's session, we will be discussing key terminologies in the context of migration, environment, and climate change. We will be discussing different typologies of disasters and environmental change, and also see how these different disasters and climate change impact mobility, especially in the context of Sri Lanka. Finally, we will discuss the global policy landscape related to climate change and mobility, and see how this applies to the context of Sri Lanka. And we will end with an open floor to discuss local priorities and follow-up actions. This session will be delivered to you by my colleagues, Rangita Balasuria, who you know very well, who is our senior focal point for migration, environment, and climate change with IOM Sri Lanka, as well as Lorenzo Guadagno, who is joining us from Geneva, where he's also working on migration, environment, and climate change. This session will be recorded, and without further ado, seeing how we are very limited in time, I will pass on the microphone to my colleagues. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Thank you, Maria, and good afternoon, esteemed participants. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks, perfect. So without further ado and building on introduction that both my colleagues provided, I would like to quickly introduce you this session. It is, as Rangita was saying, a knowledge sharing session, but we have organized a few interactive slides for this. Therefore, we would like you to use a browser window or your mobile phone in order to log on to a particular website that's called menti.com and use the code that is provided on screen or use the link that I have just shared in the chat of Zoom. And the idea is that through a few of these slides, we can get your feedback on some key questions, as well as make the presentation a little bit more interactive and perhaps a little bit more relevant to your work experience. There will be a few instances throughout the presentation when we will be requesting your inputs through this menti.com system, and we will be then looking at the answers that you have provided as they appear live on screen in this Zoom window. In general, as is the case with, I'm sure, so many webinars that you've experienced over the last year, please mute your microphone, but you can at any time use the chat box for comments, questions, or interrupting at any time, really, throughout the presentation. Just to check whether we are all on the same page and we are all good to use this system, we have prepared a first interactive slide checking whether you are logged on this website and whether you can use it without issues. So again, menti.com, it will prompt you a code which is 7851 6915, and then in alternative you can use the link that I provided in the chat box, and you will just be asked basically to input whether you're ready or not. You will see a question with possible answers, and we are going to be using this type of system for substantive feedback throughout the presentation. So I will wait until I see mostly the participants, most of the participants having used this system in order to proceed. I can only see 2 people using the system, so I'm assuming there might be some issues for the connection. I'm going to reshare the link just in case people who came in later might not have seen it. So you will go in the chat box. You can click on the link and you can access the menti.com system. In alternative, you can go to menti.com through your browser and type in the code 78516915. You have a couple more people joining. So if you have any issue using this system, please do not hesitate to let us know. So I think we can probably proceed, even though it doesn't look like there are many people that are connecting, but perhaps we will get more people on as we move on. So without further ado, and in the interest of time, let's first focus on the key terminology, so the basic terminology that is relevant to this migration, environment, and climate change domain. I would ask you again, through this menti.com system, to type in the 3 words that come to mind to you when you think about a migrant. Who is a migrant to you? How would you describe a migrant? And using 3 keywords. So we are starting to see a few things that come up, and it's very diverse. You have permanent and temporary migrants. You have people that cross borders, that remain in countries or that remain in certain region. So international or internal, got temporary. And then we got this, a person on the move or a person who travels, people that are often male, can be refugee in some cases. So this is indeed, there is indeed a big diversity of characteristics that we associate to the term migrants. Here we are seeing forced appearing. So indeed, migrants can take, the movement of migrants can take many forms. And this is really reflected in the way IOM describes a migrant. IOM gives a definition of migrants that's any person that moves across an international border or within a state out of their country, or out of their place of origin and place of residence, default place of origin. So migration basically is a movement that encompasses any kind of people, whatever the length of the movement might be, whatever the composition of the population movement, and whatever the causes of population movement. So migration includes the movement of migrant workers, but also refugees, displaced persons, and people moving for other purposes that can be also linked with family reunification. When we're talking about environmental migration, basically we're talking about this whole variety of movements, but linked to sudden or progressive changes in the environment in particular. So it's basically the movement of people who are leaving their homes because of environmental reason, mainly. There are people that might be forced to move or might choose to do so, that might move temporarily or permanently, and that might move within their country or across borders. So these are very much the characteristics that you highlighted when you were thinking about migrants through that previous interactive slide. A subset of environmental migrants is that of climate migrants. So climate migration is the movement of people who are moving because of changes in the environment due to climate change. So not just any change of the environment, but those that are linked to climate change. So we have a broad definition of migrant, a definition of environmental migrant that is part of that, and a definition of climate migrant that is a subset of environmental migration and environmental migrants. We often also hear the notion of climate refugees. Climate refugee is often used, especially in the media talk, to identify those that are displaced by disasters or climate change or the impacts of climate change. Sometimes the climate refugee is often used even for events that have a geophysical nature that result in population movements. This notion has, for some people that use it, an awareness raising value or perhaps an ethical value in terms of showing what are the impacts of climate change on people, but it needs to be highlighted that it does not have legal value. Climate refugee is not a definition that exists in international law because the Refugee Convention does not include environmental change and environmental impacts among the causes of persecution that ground the possibility of having international protection. Also, by focusing on this term refugee.
Sorry, Lorenzo, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. I think some people are having some audio issues. You are not very clear. So maybe you can just grab your microphone and speak a little bit more into the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for flagging that. I can get closer. Is it better?
Yes.
Thank you. So I was saying this notion of climate refugees does not exist in international law, and also has the additional problem that it makes us focus particularly on cross-border movements, because the movement of asylum seekers and refugees for other causes are inherently cross-borders. And as we will see after, environmental migration is much broader than that. So the terms that IOM uses are climate migrant, and even more comprehensively, environmental migrant. So environmental migration and environmental migrant, they describe this whole complexity of movements that relate to disasters and environmental changes. And we will see how important it is to have this comprehensive approach as we move to the following slides. So again, this is just an overview of some of the other terms that are associated to this domain. Different entities will use different ones: ecological migrant, environmentally induced migrant, environmentally displaced person, disaster displaced persons. IOM uses environmental migrant as the umbrella term, encompassing all of these instances in which movement is due to environmental causes. And let's look at what is this movement. And we'll start again with an activity. So if you go to your slides, you should see a question being prompted.
Lorenzo?
Yes.
Hi, Lorenzo, your sound is not clear.
I am not sure what I can do about that. So we tried before. Perhaps may I suggest that while participants reply to this question, I'll try to log off and log in again. And let's see whether that works better. Maria, can I please ask you to moderate
Yes.
the session, and I will try to log in and let's see if it's better.
Yes, I think you might be covering the microphone with your hand. That's my technological analysis so far. As Lorenzo just introduced, another Mentimeter exercise, and I hope many of you will be able to fill in. So what is, in your understanding, featuring environmental migration mostly? So you'll see, if you have the page open, that you can slide from strongly disagree to strongly agree on different aspects of migration. Once Lorenzo gets back the control over the screen, we can show you what participants are thinking generally. So it will show you an interesting visual. I'll give you a little bit of time to fill in the exercise.
Thank you, Maria.
Can you hear me better now? Yeah, so I don't know, just some Zoom problem. So can I ask, please, our Sri Lanka colleagues to give me back the rights to share the screen? And in the meanwhile, I've seen that many people have started already inputting. So thank you for your feedback on this. So the question here was, to what extent environmental migration, when you think of it, might be forced versus voluntary, short-term versus long-term, short distance versus long distance, etc. And we're seeing that most of you, that there is a big variety of answers, and in the end, the actual sliders end up pretty much in the middle of all these characteristics, let's say. And that is quite appropriate in our understanding of environmental migration, because environmental migration includes, as we were saying before, a variety of movements that really have very, very different characteristics and that relate to forced and voluntary movements, short and long-term movements, etc. So when we are thinking about environmental migration, we're really thinking about different types of movement that can be along all these spectrums and can be a combination of all these different factors. Concretely, this umbrella definition can include movements that look a little bit like labor migration, so movement of people that get out of a certain area in order to work abroad and gain a livelihood and improve their incomes or diversify their incomes. Or it can look like disaster displacement, so the movement of people who are forced to leave as a result of a disaster or in order to avoid a disaster, so in order to save their lives and perhaps bring some key assets with them out of disaster areas. In other occasions, these environmental movements can look like planned relocation. So whenever there is a process whereby the movement of people is assisted, people are settled in a new location, and they receive assistance to rebuild their lives and living conditions. So migration, displacement, planned relocation, they can all be linked with these environmental events and phenomena. Sometimes you will hear the term human mobility used as an umbrella term for encompassing all these different types of movement. In particular, this has been developed under the climate change policy at the global level. So there are all these different terminologies that are being used, and again, they describe slightly different approaches to this issue. For us, again, the term environmental migration is important because it provides us with a way to look comprehensively at this phenomenon. The other element that we really need to think about when we look at environmental migration is that migration is always multi-causal. So there are very few movements that are exclusively linked with environmental factors, and most population movements are determined both by environmental factors and by other types of drivers that can relate to the demographic situation of a certain area, the political system, the economic opportunities that are available, the social features of the place where people live. So all these factors that are environmental and social, as well as political, demographic, and economic, they act in conjunction in order to determine to what extent people want to live and can live, actually. But environmental change and environmental events are important because they affect all the other drivers as well. So the environmental processes and environmental events will affect the economic opportunities available, will affect the demographic of a certain place. So we need to understand the environment and environmental change as a driver by itself, but also as an influencing factor of all the rest. And it's not just the environmental change that actually happens, but it's the perception that people have of change and how change will affect their well-being in the future. That being said, the decision to actually move or not move will always depend on the characteristics of people and the context in which they are living. So it's not because these factors and these drivers are in play that people will necessarily migrate, but the migration will actually depend on their ability to migrate and their obstacles that they are facing to their migration. So let's look more in particular about these environmental processes and events that we have mentioned. And again, we will start from your own experience in Sri Lanka. And we would like you to just give us an example of some environmental event or an environmental process that has affected Sri Lanka in the past or is affecting the country right now and is of particular concern. So we have a mix of very different processes here. Even civil war, which is a kind of a political / social type of process, as well as a number of other environmental events, such as tsunami or landslides, or longer term processes such as prolonged droughts, changes in rainfall patterns, and deforestation. And as we move to the next session, Rangita will actually look a little bit more closely to some of these events and patterns in the country. So, but the important thing here to keep in mind is the diversity of these potential impacts. Every country is affected by multiple events or processes of environmental origin. As far as environmental events go, we are usually talking about sudden onset events, so type of hazards that can take seconds to days to develop, as well as slow onset events that can last weeks or can last months in order to produce impacts. And we're all usually talking about all these different sets of hazards that are linked with natural processes, environmental processes. It can be geophysical, such as what you mentioned, the tsunami; hydrological, the flooding that that someone had mentioned in the previous slide as well; cyclones that are meteorological, or climatological that can be associated with longer term changes in climate patterns such as extreme heat or drought and sometimes wildfires. At the same time, many countries are facing slower onset processes of environmental change that take decades to actually play out and produce impacts on the communities. And some of them, again, you had mentioned temperature change, deforestation, and there are many others that affect countries due to both local level use of resources and because of global climate change. With climate change really now happening and taking this role of accelerator of all the other non-climatic, slower onset changes that countries are seeing, such as, for instance, land degradation or the degradation of aquatic ecosystems. So all these processes can produce impacts, negative impacts for the community, and can become disasters. But they only produce these impacts if they affect communities that are exposed to those impacts. So people that live in areas affected by those phenomena, or assets that are in the areas affected by those phenomena. And if these people and assets are actually vulnerable to their impact. In those cases, we have disasters. So disasters that can threaten or disrupt the functioning of community societies and heavily affect individuals to the point where there is no capacity locally to cope with these impacts. And therefore, we are suffering negative consequences. The negative consequence of these processes can be, of course, very different. We go from the immediate impacts on lives, assets, infrastructure, to threats to the sustainability of livelihoods, such as, for instance, when crop yields are decreased, or fish cannot be caught anymore at the same level, or when there is just a limited demand for labor, as well as longer-term impacts on well-being. There are, for instance, associated when essential services are disrupted, where communities disintegrate, and when we lose the value of environmental assets and resources that are around us. So all these impacts can depend on the processes and events that we've seen before. And moving in the context of these processes and events is for many people a way to avoid these negative impacts. So the mobility, the movement consequences of these events and processes are a natural thing, let's say, of disasters happening and of environmental events taking place. Of course, they can be very different depending on what scenario we're looking at. When we are, for instance, considering a cyclone, we will mostly have movement that starts in a very concentrated manner, a lot of people moving together at the same time, whereas perhaps in a drought period, we will see people moving across weeks or months once they decide that the situation locally is not viable anymore. We can identify a more clear cause for movement in the case, for instance, of a cyclone or a tsunami, whereas causes are way more difficult to determine when we're looking with slower onset processes of environmental degradation. And also, it's easier to say that movement is forced when you have 10,000 people evacuating because a cyclone is coming, than when you have a drought, for instance, progressively eroding people's ability to work and get a livelihood in the place where we live. But there are some commonalities among these different scenarios. First of all, in many cases, the movement of people that are moving because of environmental reason is short distance and internal. So cross-border movements or long-distance movement are the exception rather than the rule. Most people tend to move towards destination they know well, whether in the country or outside the country if they have, for instance, family somewhere else, but they move to places that they know well, where they have moved in the past, where they have networks, and when they can count on resources. Most of these movements are temporary, even though the length of the displacement or the migration is very much also determined by what are the environmental conditions in the place of origin. So can people return? Is recovery progressing relatively quickly? Can people even return to places that are becoming inhabitable, for instance? And in all these scenarios, we really need to keep in mind that the movement can be diverse and can evolve over time. So a disaster such as cyclone will also trigger some level of migration, not just evacuations and what would be called disaster displacement. There are also going to be people that are moving out for finding, for instance, labor opportunities. And sometimes a movement that starts a displacement then becomes some sort of longer term stay with people finding a life in their place of destination. So we need to avoid oversimplification of these scenarios, and we really need to take this complex and comprehensive approach to these movements in the context of disasters and environmental change. We also need to keep in mind that in some cases, disasters and environmental changes might result in reduced movement of people. They might limit the ability of people to move out of at-risk areas. And this is, of course, a major form of vulnerability. You've seen how many challenges migrants and potential migrants have been facing because of lockdowns, now with COVID, for instance, and movement restrictions internally and across borders. Well, that's something that can happen with other disasters as well. If disasters disrupt the ability of people to move, then they are likely to make them even more vulnerable, because people cannot go to places where they can find safety or they can find assistance. And this is the issue of trapped population that has been highlighted by a number of research and policy dialogues. Lastly, for this session, we need to understand that all this movement, migration, all this environmental migration in the context of disaster is mainly seen as a problem, but it's also a solution for many people. It's a way to preserve their lives, to get access to assistance, to improve their opportunities on the short term and in long term in terms of livelihoods, in terms of ability to access services, etc. So migration can be a positive adaptation strategy and a way to diversify livelihoods and promote resilience. So it's not just an issue, but it's also a solution to many of these environmental problems and environmental challenges for the people that are affected. So in order to localize a little bit these challenges and impacts, we have prepared another interactive slide, and we would like to know from you what you think are the three key environmental events or processes that are most likely to cause migration in Sri Lanka. You will see on Menti you have a list of potential environmental events and processes that are listed, and we're asking you to select the three that are more likely to cause migration in the country according to you. Okay, you can see that there is a diversity of opinion here as well, with flash floods and deforestation being the clear factors that most are indicating. You can, again, think back at what we were saying before, that it is very likely that these processes and events will produce different types of movements as well. Flash floods are likely going to result in concentrated and movements that can be resolved relatively quickly, whereas something like sea level rise tends to result in inhabitability of the places where people are coming from. So it might result in actual movements that perhaps are permanent out of these affected areas. And other, of course, events and processes will produce very, very different types of mobility for people that are affected. So in order to explore a little bit how these processes and events have played out in the Sri Lanka context, I then will leave the floor to my colleague Rangita, who has prepared some slides specifically on events that affected the country in the last years. So Rangita, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And thank you very much for that detailed presentation. And I think you have done a great job by giving all those key terminologies and the aspect of environment, migration, and climate change as a start. So let us now move into the Sri Lankan context. In this, Lorenzo, will you be able to just help me with the slides? Thank you. Um, so we all have perceived, I mean, all have seen, we have all read, and also we have experienced quite disastrous flash floods in September 2020. So according to the statistics, we have seen that 5,507 families and 8 divisional secretaries in Colombo district has been affected due to the torrential rains. So these sort of things do happen in the most commercial areas of Sri Lanka. So when it comes to Colombo district, it's with dense population, as well as most of these people are actually living in some condominiums at times, and also like scattered areas where like you have dense population. And also when it comes to these people, they might be not having proper accessibility towards water as well in the urban setting. However, with all these settings in a very congested area, all these people are trying to make their livelihood. At the same time, most of the people who are living in these urban areas, they have a tendency of maybe, they will just drop their garbage into wastewater systems, as well, also like the streams around them. So they also have some sort of a responsibility among them to lead their lives in such a way that it is not adding further into climate change, or maybe some aspects of mobility later on. Now, when you move into some sort of other environmental issue, that is like prolonged droughts. So you could see that in the dry zone. So according to the central bank data, you could just see that how the dry zones dry effect has actually having some sort of an impact towards the GDP of the country as well. So Sri Lanka predominantly being an agricultural country, an economic, contributing to economy in that nature, from the historical point of view. However, today we have seen there are lots of gaps in our GDP contribution towards agriculture. So if you just talk to some people, like during like past studies, we have like spoken to some of the people who are living in these drought-prone areas. When we speak to them, mostly these people might say, well, yes, we see a seasonal sort of a change. There's a rainfall pattern. I mean, it just changed. We don't get our harvest on time. Maybe the crops, like, we have some issues. There are many pesticide issues, and these sort of things are happening. It's not like the earlier times, and we don't have sufficient water. So if you just talk to them and if you ask them, okay, so what do you think had been the real cause behind it? They might really say, okay, so maybe the environment is changing. So then we are trying to move into another location, and we are trying to start ahead with our agricultural, livelihood patterns, or maybe agricultural processes. Well, if you just ask from them, maybe do you really know what is meant by climate change? Perhaps the answer would be no, because they don't really understand this term, but yet they see the symptoms of it, and they come to a conclusion or like a judgment. Yes, the environment is changing, so let's move into some other sort of job. So the other job would be mostly maybe riding a three-wheeler in an urban setting, which is again adding more and more carbon dioxide to this entire planet. And also it is increasing some sort of levels of high carbon and greenhouse gases. So with this scenario, you could see that most of these people, their coping mechanism or their strategies, what they're trying to take as a solution once they mobilize from one place to the other. Without their understanding, they are actually contributing to global warming once again. So, because of that, it is important that we understand what really makes their, like, their decision to mobilize from one place to the other. So in Sri Lanka, we have a major people coming from the rural areas. They do believe that they need to mobilize from one place to the other, as Lorenzo mentioned earlier. Like, people do internally move from one place to the other. Most probably, if you look at the Sri Lankan context, if you ask from them, mostly they would be saying, yes, it's based on my economic situation. I'm just trying to cope up my economic situation. So I'm trying to make a better livelihood for myself. Maybe I want to earn quick cash. However, most of these people who are coming from the agricultural settings, primary sector workers, they really do not understand what has really been their impact to their life. So if you dig into their history and if you really try to understand, most probably they are moving to these urban settings, most probably due to their harvest lost, or maybe they find it very complex to understand the seasonal changes or rainfall patterns and things like that, extreme drought conditions. So because of that, what they try to do is they feel that their lands are of no value right now, so they tend to move. And with this urbanization, so based on these recent more statistics, you could see that there are some certain areas in the Colombo district specifically that are being like with dense population, and it's also further increasing again and again. With all these patterns, we all are in a great danger at the moment. So if urbanization is taking place, maybe we have to see some sort of adaptation mechanisms, like sort of resilient living, because climate change is taking place in these areas as well. So when it comes to these environmental factors and the relationship between uh, the mobility of people, there is a very close connection. So what we're trying to do right now is to understand this nexus. Lorenzo? This is one of the events which just took place, like maybe it's been like last 2 weeks. So there were some of the people who are coming, I mean, originated from the southern province of Sri Lanka, and so the minister of environment announced on how the local welfare association representing around 1,800 families had written to the president requesting permission to extract mineral sands and sell the product to an Indian company. So with this, we saw there are many protests taking place, and then some of the government officials visited these sites, and then they have seen the the urge. Some people tried to stop it, and some people really want it to happen. If you look at the danger behind it, is that during the recent years, coastal erosion was accelerated due to upstream anthropogenic activities and poorly planned coastal infrastructure development, so adding stresses on the coastal ecosystems. So this is actually one of the maps, that the satellite map, which actually shows like how erosion had taken place. Now, yes, so when these sort of coastal erosion or soil degradation takes place, does it really impact to the lives of these people in the coastal area? Of course, yes, because most of these people in Sri Lanka scattered in the coastal areas, because it's being a very small state, it's an island, having had used to have a very beautiful shore, right now being polluted into the massive extreme levels. However, these people are also faced with a lot of issues and threats. Uh, Next slide, please. So at last, the ADPs, one of the earlier studies had given us this map, which you could see in your left side of your monitor. So this map is actually predicting the sea level rise. But yet, when it comes to the study that had been done by Lakshika and Ratnayaka in 2020, uh, according to this particular study, you could see that there are much more sea level rise taking place than it was predicted. So if you look at the statistics, you could see that the sea level is expected to rise by about 0.1 meters to 0.2 meters during the next 50 years. However, the progression will be taking so quickly, and we are in some sort of a real danger. So this is like a cross-country analysis, like with Maldives and Sri Lanka. So I think there are colleagues from Maldives as well. So climate change is not going to be something which is happening, it's not only a country context or country-specific activity. It's a global thing. And we need to understand mobility also would take place, not only internal, but even outside the country as well. So therefore, all these issues has to be identified in such a way that to understand the context and the nexus between it. Thank you very much. Over to you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Rangita, for this. And as we were saying at first, we will just finish this before we leave the space for questions, answers, comments, with a quick view of the policy landscape. And here we have mapped how this issue of climate migration, environmental migration has been addressed throughout the UN climate change conferences throughout the years. And perhaps the one thing that I would really like to focus on in terms of the latest key developments has been, starting with the Paris 2015 conference, the creation of the task force on displacement. That basically it's an inter-institutional body that looks at specifically the ways to operationalize what the three main objectives that climate change negotiations have identified relevant to climate mobility and let's call it environmental migration as we have. So the need to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse impacts of climate change. At COP24, as in Katowice, this task force on displacement presented to the member states a set of recommendations that relate to the need to integrate environmental migration, displacement, and plan relocation in policies and in action related to climate. And here we have identified a few of the key takeaways that these recommendations include. So first of all, again, the need to address all forms of human mobility. So the need, and I cannot stress this enough, to have this comprehensive approach that looks at displacement, it looks at migration, that is more like with labor migration or family migration, and plan relocation. The need to really address migration concerns within climate change and disaster policies at the national level, and the need in general to align climate policy and migration policies more closely. And again, just perhaps out of these recommendations 7, the need to do this through a collaborative approach. We have line ministries that are relevant to this. Every country has institutions that deal with disasters, that deal with the environmental impacts of climate change, that deal with migration and displacement. And it is really important to work across institutions, to involve communities, to involve individuals that are affected and that are or that have been affected by these impacts and that have migrated or that might be moving in the future. So again, this task force on displacement, which is about that's still ongoing, really provided a set of recommendations that look at the way forward, basically, on these topics for global and national policies. At the same time, we also have another set of frameworks that are really relevant for the global policies discussion on this issue. We have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction that looks at a number of mobility issues, evacuations and displacements that are seen as a key concern for preparedness, response and recovery to disasters. The need to promote transboundary cooperation to address cross-border displacement. The need to look at planned relocations to reduce exposure to hazards in cases in which risks cannot be mitigated otherwise. And in general, the need to address disaster-induced human mobility in a sustainable manner. Lastly, in terms of development of global policies, another key milestone has been the launch of the Global Compact for Migration, which clearly articulates a comprehensive understanding of this nexus between migration, environment, and climate change, and in particular in its objective 2, where it highlights the need to minimize the drivers and factors that compel people to leave their countries of origin. So basically to minimize the factors that lead to forced migration, including disasters, the adverse impacts of climate change, and environmental degradation. So very much a focus at global level for policies related to migration, to climate change, and to disasters, this nexus between environmental processes and events and environmental migration. So what we're seeing, however, is that there is not much coherence among these dialogues at global level, nor at local level and national level, of course. But we really need to promote it by doing mainly two things, basically. Whenever we are developing policies and operations that deal with environment, climate change, and disasters, we need to take the human mobility component into account. And vice versa, whenever we look at displacement or migration policies, we really need to make sure that environment, climate change, and disaster concerns are integrated. And over the last 5 years, let's say, there have been a number of mappings to look at our climate policies and disaster risk reduction plans and migration policies really integrate these different topics. So this is a little bit the global picture where we are now, a recognition of this issue in a number of relevant work streams, little policy coherence so far, and some progress at national level. So in order to explore this a little bit more closely, perhaps I would invite you to share any update, any development that you think is particularly relevant to the context of Sri Lanka right now, or else just take the floor now. So you can decide how you want to provide your inputs and feedback on this topic, whether taking the floor or sharing your inputs through our Menti system that we've used so far. So I guess I'll open the floor for any comment, question by the participants. And again, you can use the Menti system to provide feedback. I'm seeing. Maybe Rangita, if while we have while we wait for feedback, or while someone decides to take the floor, perhaps you can quickly provide an update based on the slides that you had prepared.
Yes, Lorenzo. Let me ask, is it okay if I just take the lead? So may I ask from the participants, so you have already done a lot of activities in your day-to-day work. So would you like to let us know what sort of activities that you do in this particular nexus, if you have done so? Like, for example, maybe some sort of changes in the environment that you have seen and the areas that you work, and also to know where people I see a lot of people joined from agriculture, Ministry of Agriculture, as well as Ministry of Fisheries, and DMC. Ministry of Land.
Yeah, I am Madara from NBRO under the Disaster Management Ministry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you,
loud and clear.
Madara. Thanks a lot for
Yeah.
joining. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, considering the migrant movement, if I say in Sri Lanka, water scarcity during drought during drought in dry zone is a common problem. So people have to move distances. I mean, if I consider the smallest administrative unit is the GA, Gram Sevaka division. So people have to move, have to cross borders of GN to fetch safe water. So the problem is immense, and no one is talking the severity of the problem. And people have to move, and no source of moving. Even they do not have bicycles, or no, they have to walk distances to search water. So I think it has not been considered as a migrant movement. As it's a is that the severity of the problem is increasing due to the climate change. Okay, I have to put that concern.
Thank you, Madara. It is a very valid point. Yes, we have seen in the realistic settings, like people do walk and travel a long way to fetch water. Yes.
Hello.
Lorenzo, do you have?
Yeah,
Yes.
hello, I am Frank Jasing from the Smallholder Agribusiness Partnership Development Program. Hello,
Yes, Mr.
can
Frank.
you?
Yes, we can
Yes,
hear you.
as I am the consultant climate change and environment in this particular project, then actually we have some experience in the our mid-country area in the Matale and the Kandy district. There are some tea lands have become marginalized as a result of the erosion of the topsoil of that particular areas. And as a result, the tea land has been abandoned, and also the community who depend on this tea land also have abandoned those tea lands because of the low productivity as a result of the eroding of the soil and become the marginal tea land. Those are our experience in as a worker in the mid-country area. Then therefore, as a result, we have to find out some strategies to improve their living standard by introducing some alternative income generation activities. This has been a main issue in the mid-country and up-country tea lands as a result of the not conserving the soil, topsoil erosion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frank, for your experience, what you shared right now.
Hello.
Any others?
Yeah, hello. I am Nadika from Sustainable Development Council.
Yes, Ms. Nadika, please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Okay. I also want to share with that some experience when we are looking at the agriculture sector in Sri Lanka, because as example, I can say that when we looking at Mahavali irrigation project, it was the largest multi-diversity development project in Sri Lanka, and it basically focused on the 1/3 of country land, and it based on the agriculture development and irrigation purposes. But when we are looking at now, the most of the land allocated in large scale to monotype cultivation. So it can be affected in highly for the disaster creating, because the it has because Mahavali development project is planned for the particular purpose to enhance the livelihood of the small scale farmers and the water distribution in the large scale. But when we are going for the monoculture land allocation, it can be helping to make a disaster in one end without in one end it goes to the water scarcity and also land degradation. Likewise, we have to consider that one also in the development scenario in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Indeed, Ms. Nadika, thank you very much for that valuable insight from you. I think that is something that we all need to focus. Any others, maybe from the Agriculture Ministry? Mr. Jayanati? I think we can't hear you, Mr. Jayanati. Mr. Jayanati? Unfortunately, I think we cannot hear Mr. Jayanati. He's representing Ministry of Agriculture. Mr. Jayanati, if you could kindly leave your comment in the chat box. Any ideas from Coast Guard, Sri Lanka Navy on the soil erosion or coastal degradation?
Rangita, I'm Dilanthi Kodalakama.
Yes, Dr. Dilanthi.
I would like to share my experience about this coastal erosion and the landing site limitation for migrant fishers. Although we are talking about these permanent migration and other sort of migration, I think we most of the time we are neglecting these seasonal migrants because of the monsoon. That is also environment factor, climate factor, the monsoon, and this has created, as in the previous Lorenzo's speech, he mentioned that the vulnerability, increase their vulnerability. And one thing is that due to the coastal erosion, the available land, available beach area is decreasing for these migrant fishers, where they usually use for their camping to construct, to establish their wadi. Yeah, so it is one thing. Also, the migration, the other thing is immigration, right? So the people who flew, who went to India and other areas during the war time are now returning, asking or looking for their own lands. And that has also created the restriction on land for this these migrants. So it has increased their vulnerability and further creating conflicts. If we are looking about the migration, either permanent or seasonal, temporary migration, I think we need to look such aspects as well, especially along the coastal area.
Thank you, Dr. Dilanthi. I think you have done many researchers also in this area. And thank you very much for your insights. I think you have evidence-based facts over here. So if all of you, I mean, most of you have actually provided your thoughts, your insights and your comments, maybe your experiences, what you had been doing day to day. Lorenzo, shall we then?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm really happy that we got this feedback through such a short presentation. For me, who am probably the least aware of the local context, having all these pointers to all these phenomena and types of mobility that are relevant really provides a good picture of how complex this issue is that you're confronting, and that we will be working together through this process and project. So this variety of environmental events and processes that we need to keep in mind, the variety of movement consequences, whether there's seasonal and temporary migration, displacement, longer term movement, and urbanization, etc. So it is really interesting to see the variety and the diversity of this context in Sri Lanka. And yeah, I look forward to being in touch with you all as we move forward to the next phases of this process. So I would like to thank everyone for their participation and for their availability to use this interactive methodology for this presentation. And I will wish you all a nice end of the day, and I will give you back to Flora, Anita.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. And also, I also want to wish like all the best for all these people who are representing this training today, because most of these participants who are like representing as participants for this particular training are actually part of our steering committee. So I wish to also announce all of you, if possible, kindly enable your video so we could click a picture like with all of you, all participants, so that we could share that with all of you as a final note. Okay, thank you very much. And so I wish to ask all of you to interact with us, and also we have upcoming research, and our research organization participant is also here from Institute of Policy Studies, and we wish to obtain your feedback, your comments, and your insights as another, round of support to our study. So all of you have a great level of engagement and practical experience in this field while working with communities, with policy development, as well as with government counterparts. So do share with us all your experience and knowledge and things like that. We would much appreciate to have all of you on board. Let me now give the floor to Maria for the final remarks. Maria,
Yeah,
over to you.
what can I say? Thank you to everyone for actively participating in this session. I think it's been very rich. And yeah, we look forward to working together in the future on this project. And thank you very much. All have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. Then we'll see you soon, physically. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.